they just cannot operate correctly. They can't color inside the lines. I mean, so many times people joke about Trump acting like a toddler, and this order really zeroes in on the idea that his entire image is based on a lie.
Welcome to Law and Chaos. Today we'll be joined by Jose Pagliery of the Daily Beast to discuss the massive $355 million civil fraud verdict against Donald Trump and the Trump Organization in New York. Jose was in the courtroom for all 3 months of the Trump fraud trial, as well as for both the E.G. and Carroll defamation cases, and he was first on the beat to break down the financial impact of those two judgments on Trump's financial empire. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get after it. Hey guys, it's Liz Dye. I am back, and I'm super excited to have the Daily Beast's Jose Pagliery with us today. He's a political investigations reporter who covers the Trump legal beat better than anyone. He was the first to point out that New York's 9% interest rate was going to add as much as $100 million to the penalty in this case. Remember, the meter started running on a bunch of those fines years ago, not just when the judgment came down last week. And Jose has been in the courtroom to watch Trump and his lawyers do their weird performative dance. I wouldn't call it lawyering. But before we jump into the interview, I just want to say thank you for all of the support from you guys. It's been incredible. We're 5 episodes into the show, and we're quickly approaching 100 5-star reviews on iTunes. So if you are digging the show and you have a minute, maybe go give us a review at iTunes or whatever platform you listen on. And of course, I cannot thank you guys enough for all the other ways in which you've supported the show and helped us grow. You guys are sharing it on social media. I love it. And we have a long list of people who signed up to support the show financially through patreon.com/lawandchaospod or the Law and Chaos Pod Substack. I need to thank all of you, which I will be doing over the next few episodes. If you subscribe, the premium feed already has extra episodes, longer interviews, and the episodes are always ad-free at every level of support. And those episodes always drop at least a little bit earlier than the regular feed. We rely on financial support from our listeners, and I'm so grateful to everybody who stepped up to keep the lights on here at Res Ipsa Media. So, I have heard that on other shows, the hosts will sometimes read funny subscriber names on the air, but I appreciate that on Substack, it's a little less relaxed and groovy. So for today, I'm just going to read first names, and if your first name is, say, John, know that I am thanking all the Johns listening to the show as well, and as well as the John who subscribed via Substack. Okay, so from Substack, thank you to Goat Flavor, John, Bob, M. Finch, JT, Al, Samuel, Jacob, Alec, Brandon, Val, Robert, Rachel, Thomas, Tana, Anna, Jennifer, Ari, Snaploud, and Maria. Thanks so much. And from Patreon, thank you to Hunter, Constance, Violet, Jake, Bravura Bookkeeping, Small Business and Nonprofit Accounting, Kelly, Matthew, Jim, and Lawrence. I really, really appreciate it. And before we get to the show, just a brief ad break, and we will be right back. And with us today is Jose Pagliery, a political investigations reporter at the Daily Beast. He's written for CNN, the Miami Herald, and the AJC, and he's covered every one of the Trump trials in New York over the past year. Jose, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here, Liz. Thank you for having me.
So let's get into it. Let's start off with the most recent $355 million verdict in the civil fraud trial, and maybe we'll work backwards from there, time permitting. You were the first to really break down what it will mean for Trump to have to post close to $500 million in cash, including that prior Carroll verdict, during the pendency of his appeal. Can you talk us through the math there?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the main point I want to start with is just how devastating this will be for him, because the $355 million figure is really just the initial judgment, right? That doesn't include the interest, which is it's the clock has been running for some time now, and it's running through different tiers, right? So some date back a year, some date back 2 years, 3 years. And so when you add it all up together, we're looking at adding up $100 million in interest or more. And so that brings up the figure to $450 million roughly. But but it actually keeps going from there because
Right.
he's not going to want to pay it. He's not going to. There are questions about whether or not he even has the means, and we'll get into that in a second.
Right.
But beyond that, in order to appeal this judgment in New York, he is going to have to front the money, either himself or find some surety company that will do it for him. And that's where it gets really tricky. That's where, if we look at what the judge did on Friday, we understand that he's being squeezed. This was a full-on attack. It's a pincer movement where he's being sort of crushed between two forces. One is how much money he has to pay, but the other is what really seems like an inability and freedom in how he chooses to pay it. Because at this point, the judge has barred him from working with any bank that is licensed in New York, that is regulated by DFS, the Department of Financial Services. Now, what that means is that the banks that you and I know, and many of those that we might not, right, they all do business in the financial capital of the world, which means that they have to be regulated in New York. So if Trump wants to bond and appeal this, he's going to have to find a source of money that has a ton of capital, but for some reason or another doesn't want to do business in New York. So is that some rich Saudi prince? Is that strange foreign money that we're going to have some time like looking into? Is that going to be a friend, right? So he's going to have to post that, but he won't be posting 350 million. He won't be posting 450 million. He'll be posting the 355 million plus 10 to 20% up front.
Right. And can you talk about where that 10 to 20% comes from?
Right. And so in New York, when you do that, there is, I mean, the judgment, the initial judgment that he's facing already has a 9% interest rate baked in. So that's what brings it up to
crazy.
It really is. I mean, this was a number that was set years ago by the state during a boom economy time, right? And so it made sense for them to do that. He is really suffering from the fact that there's this holdover, but there's actually even higher interest rate when it comes to appellate bonds, where it's the total is going to be 110% to 120% of the total figure. So he's really looking at $500 million here. Who is going to give him that amount of money? Let's explore that aspect here, because that's something I got into in a recent story. The position he's in now is that he's running for president, right? And the last time around, he used the power of the presidency to hide behind the White House doors. He tried to employ the Department of Justice to stop anyone from coming after him in a civil lawsuit. So any entity that's going to lend him this money will know that if he wins come November, he will fight tooth and nail to not address this at all. They will be on the hook for the next 4 years plus, depending on whether or not you think he's going to ever, let go of that position of power. He's going to right. So he's going to be practically untouchable, employing the Department of Justice against some bank or surety company. So not only is he going to have to find some surety company or lender outside of New York, he's going to have to find one that's willing to stomach that kind of risk. So what we're really looking at here is, once again, the same position we were in 2016, this pay for play issue, the relationships he has. If you remember the way he treated the old post office in Washington, D.C., just a mile away from the White House, where he was essentially getting showered with money from foreign donors and then essentially doling out favors to them. So he's in a pretty precarious position. The way that I've had it, told to me by those who are close to the situation he's dealing with now, his legal situation, he's probably going to have to sell a building. He's going to have to sell a golf course. He's going to have to sell some assets to get this cash because he doesn't have it on hand. Barbara Jones, the outside monitor that was put in place by this judge in the bank fraud case a year ago, she has been monitoring his financials. And there is nothing that I have heard that indicates she has seen that he has the capital on hand. And even though a year ago he said that he's got some $400 million in cash, that sounds like a whole lot until you're hit with $100 million more than that, right?
Right. And I don't think that Judge Jones, will allow him to take that money out of the business to pay his own. I mean, will she? Do you think?
So that gets to the next point, right? I mean, we've got to talk about the whole scope of this order, which is massive, because not only does he have to, is he hit with this massive financial punishment and a serious inability to find a lender, This order also elevates the status of Barbara Jones, whereas before, this former federal judge was in a position where she would have to review Trump Organization financial transactions after the fact. And there's already a lot we know about the fact that the Trump Organization even failed to do that. She called them out on previous letters about how they didn't notify her when they would move more than $5 million, which was the threshold. This order has changed her position so that she now has the power to veto their decisions. I mean, she's in charge now. I mean, the Trump Organization, as I stated in my story, is Trump really only in name at this point, because Don Jr. and Eric, Trump's two sons that lead the company, they can't be officers at a company for several years. And so she is the boss, essentially. She's going to have to give prior authorization to whatever big financial transaction they're going to make, especially if they have to submit financial documents to any third party in order to get that kind of loan. And so, yes, Trump will be in a position where he may very well have to sell an asset, but then he's going to have to come crawling over to this former federal judge in order to get permission to do so.
Right. And I don't understand why she would let him do it. I suppose that, the company exists for its officers in some fashion. It's a family-owned business. But if your job is to ensure the viability of the company, why would you let it kick out some, substantial portion of its assets, at least above 10%, to pay somebody's bond?
So I honestly, I don't know. I could see a world in which she greenlights it. I do, because then it satisfies the judgment. So she very well might. But the truth is that it is hard for me to believe, given what I've heard from the sources in Trump's inner circle, it is hard for me to believe that he could even stomach such a thing. Because what this order does is that it is the final decision in a case about him overstating the value of his assets. And the decision reduces the real value of his assets and reduces it so much that there will be an even bigger gap between his fantasy world and reality now.
And they've really been very aggressive about it, not acknowledging reality. I'm sure that you know this, but just for the listeners, since Barbara Jones has been in charge, they have not put out statements of financial condition, the thing that they got dinged on for being fraudulent, that they've refused to kind of put out, and Justice Engoron called them out on it in his order. And he said either they're unwilling or unable to put out a non-fraudulent statement of financial condition.
That's right. I'll read from the order. I pulled this line out yesterday. It says that, moreover, the fact that the Trump Organization has refused to prepare statements of financial condition, even though various loan covenants obligate them to do so ever since the monitor was appointed, leads the court to conclude that the Trump Organization cannot or will not prepare an accurate SFC that is GAAP compliant and that values assets at their estimated current values. I mean, that's quite telling, right? I mean, what he's saying here is that the monitorship that we put in place a year ago tells us already that this is essentially a fraudulent enterprise. They continued to act this way, even not only while they were under investigation, but also while they were fighting this at trial. They just cannot operate correctly. They can't color inside the lines. I mean, so many times people joke about Trump acting like a toddler, and this order really zeroes in on the idea that his entire image is based on a lie. I mean, the thing that propelled him into the White House in 2016 was this notion that he was a successful businessman if you ignore the 4 corporate bankruptcies that his hotels and casinos went through, right? And a lot of us already knew, like, this guy he's a marketer, right? He lies, he talks a big talk, he built up this glittering image with the tabloids in the New York City 1980s. And what this order does is say, look, you were all right. This is a house of cards. It's built on lies. We're going to force them to pay, and we're going to put someone in place that's going to right the ship. But that takes a lot of work because they were unable to do it themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting in Justice Engoron's order that he drew attention to exactly what the lie bought them, right? That the difference between the interest rate he got based on his lie and the interest rate he would have gotten based on the truth was so substantial, it would have, it undergirded the whole enterprise.
Right. And, there was an argument that his lawyers used constantly in court. I was there for the 3-month trial, almost every day. And they just kept hitting the same point, and it just wasn't resonating. The judge chucked it out constantly, which is that, well, no harm, no foul, right? I mean, even if we lied, even if we overstated something, look, we got the loans, we paid the banks got their money, we got the loans we wanted, we cut the business deals we did, everything came out on top. We all came out on top. It's okay. And this is an argument that I've heard from even people that I'm close to. Like, hey, did he really do anything wrong if it ended up okay? Well, the judge addressed that, in court, but he also did so in this order, which is that's not the point, right? Like, the law doesn't exist so that you can go ahead and do, 50 miles over the speed limit on the highway and it's okay because nobody got hurt. No, you're still going to get pulled over. It's wrong because it's wrong. Society has decided that this particular action is immoral or dangerous. And what this judge said in his order is we have to keep New York, the financial capital of the world, honest. We can't let people or businesses get away with lying about these things because, sure, in this case, nobody got hurt. And he says so. Justice Engoron says so. But the next bank might not be so lucky.
Right. And I don't think that nobody got hurt. I mean, I think Justice Engoron made real clear in his order that, for instance, on the Doral loan, the lie netted Trump $10 million, right, that he did not have to pay to Deutsche Bank every year because that was the distance between the commercial loan, which he could have gotten, and the personal loan, which he got based on his, lies about his own wealth. But I actually want to circle back to something that you said, because you were in the courtroom and people are so curious about it because the lawyers in this case have become, I wouldn't say celebrities, maybe infamous is a better term. From my observation, could not figure out whether they were trying to do actual law or they were trying to do some other kind of performance art thing. You were there. What do you think?
Performance art at the max. I mean, this was, I felt like I was watching a Fox News hit for almost 8 hours a day, 11 weeks on end. Christopher Kise used to be the Solicitor General in Florida. He's a pretty intelligent man. Mm-hmm. Clifford Robert, he's an attorney in New York. He's really intelligent as well. Fantastic delivery, his opening and closing statements. He has the incredible ability to just like zero in on a particular topic and argue well about it. But the types of arguments that they were raising in court were, for the most part, things that the judge had already ruled on. He had already tossed them aside. Both sides had asked for summary judgment ahead of the trial. And the judge had determined conclusively that, Trump had committed bank fraud. We're going to still explore these like 6 other points, but no, your arguments that this is a political ploy by a Democrat to go after a leading Republican, that it doesn't address it. It has nothing to do with this case. The facts are the facts. The argument that any sort of harm to the banks was immaterial and therefore executive law, 6312 shouldn't be utilized. That has nothing to do with it either. The AG has a responsibility to ensure a fair and honest marketplace. He tossed all those arguments aside, and then we show up in court, and the lawyers are still going at it. And when the judge calls them out on it, and the clerk who sits by him, the law clerk who sits by Justice Engoron, calls them out on it too, because she's a very vocal clerk. She's constantly involved. She would not let them get away with this kind of stuff. They then turn their attention to her, and the attorneys start attacking her, which forces the judge to then suddenly like come into the position where he has to defend his own staff. And so, no, it was a circus. And I've called it that in my stories. I mean, there were times when the attorneys would spend most of an hour wasting time in court talking about how unfair this all was and how dare the law clerk interject when really it was her job to do so. It was Justice Engoron's job to stop them in their tracks and say, we've got to actually address the legal issues at hand. And by the way, this is something that I've seen in every courtroom that Trump's lawyers have been in. I don't know what it is about this man. I don't know if it's the type of people he hires or the fact that once they start working for him, they change their approach to appease their client. But at every moment in time, this is a performance for one person. This is a show that's put on for the king. The king is in the courtroom. He's pissed off and he wants to feel vindicated. He's always an entertainer. This is nothing more than a TV show for him, and he wants to see it play out. I mean, he's made several references actually to legal dramas when he talks about it and when he complains about what's going on in the courtroom, but that's the way he sees the world.
Right. Actually, that's a pretty good segue into the Carroll cases because you were in court for both of those too, weren't you? Both the Carroll 1 and Carroll 2?
Carroll 1 and Carroll 2. Yep.
So what was that like watching? It was some of the same lawyers. I mean, Alina Habba was in both courtrooms, and I've written about her a lot. What did you observe in the courtroom? I mean, do you think his lawyers were doing real law in the Carroll case where it wasn't, in some sense, or at least the first go around, wasn't already a kind of a done deal?
This is fascinating because so much of the legal work that needed to be done on the defense side in both Carroll cases was work that needed to be done before trial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so talking to witnesses, doing that DNA test from Trump to figure out whether or not his DNA was on that infamous coat dress, right?
Mm-hmm. Securing an expert witness, which they managed to not do both go-rounds, that was impressive.
Right. I mean, so a lot of this work was at the front end, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I did cover that too. I covered the legal back and forth before the trial. But the legal work that was supposed to be done then just wasn't there. I mean, by the time that Joe Tacopina, the celebrity criminal defense lawyer, showed up at the first Carroll trial, in some ways his hands were already tied because
right.
No matter what he said in court, he couldn't talk about the dress. He couldn't talk about the DNA because years earlier, Trump had decided he wasn't going to get his DNA test. And by the time he changed his mind, it was too late. The judge had closed the door in discovery. And so whatever performance he had in court, he was already driving down a pretty narrow lane. He couldn't turn off any direction. What he could have done is had Trump testify in court, right? But
that's
Trump didn't even do that.
Thing.
Trump ghosted his first trial.
Yeah, no. So just like, let me make it clear to the listeners. I believe that Joseph Tacopina entered his appearance in February and the trial was like in April. By then, discovery was closed. It was too late. And Tacopina did do a bunch of things, which, you could call them publicity stunts or you could call them, good. I wouldn't characterize it that way. But I mean, I might characterize them as publicity stunts, but he did a bunch of things to try and get the dress in later and to try and impeach Carroll in certain ways. But it was far too late. Alina Habba, who had been driving the bus for a couple of years since Trump's very competent counsel, Mark Kasowitz, withdrew, it was just too late. And he couldn't get an expert witness in. Now, I will say that in the second trial, Alina Habba tried to put the same expert witness who got tossed in the first trial and claimed to be shocked when that expert witness got tossed. But what you're saying is that Tacopina had very little to do. So can you tell me what he did do with that narrow, road that he had to drive down?
I mean, he used the trial to cast doubt on Carroll, but the best way to do so would have also required to have his client show up and testify. And his client didn't. And so instead, all the jury had to work with was this extremely damning deposition where Trump comes off as the idiotic, misogynist pig that we all know him to be.
Right.
And so that tanked him. That was over and done with. But with that second trial where Alina Habba was the lead lawyer, then too, there was such a failure to prepare for this case ahead of time that trial was also one where they had almost no avenues. I mean, by the time Trump showed up to testify, the Judge Kaplan, rightly so, said, you have like 3 questions to answer here. There's not much more you can say. You haven't done you didn't prepare for this whatsoever. The only things you can say now were essentially why you did what you did and what you have to say for yourself now over your constant lies. I mean, no argument at that second Carroll trial was a legal argument. It was, again, a Fox News hit. It was one where they were complaining about the fact that they even had to be in this position. That's not a legal argument. I did notice, by the way, that when the Save America PAC that Trump uses for his reelection, when they disclosed all of their expenditures recently, a massive sum had gone to his lawyers, but one line item really jumped out at me, and it was for this private investigative firm in Brooklyn run by 2 former NYPD guys. And when I dug around and found out why it was that they were hired, we at the Daily Beast were able to explain that they were actually hired to look back and investigate what screw ups Trump's legal team had done in the Carroll cases. And what these private eyes had found was that Trump's counsel, ahead of Carroll 1 and Carroll 2, had not even interviewed the key witnesses at Bergdorf Goodman, the department store where this sexual assault took place. They haven't even interviewed the witnesses. And so they didn't, it was just miserable legal work in this case. It's astounding that Trump, with all of his money and all of his power, could not line up the right people to defend him, especially at that second trial.
Yeah. So can I just walk you back to the first trial for a second? Because you've said that Trump, didn't test, and it sounds like you think Trump not testifying was a mistake. I've written a bunch that I thought it was the only thing Tacopina could do because Trump was, look, you watch the deposition videos where Trump said he did not want to sleep. Just volunteered out of the blue that he didn't want to sleep with Carroll's lawyer, Roberta Kaplan, and, made all kinds of really gross misogynist statements. Do you think it was a mistake to not put him on the stand the first time?
I don't know. That deposition was so damning. I don't even know that that there was a way to get out of that. Keep in mind, when he did that deposition, the attorney he had at his side was Alina Habba, who didn't jump soon enough when he misidentified E. Jean Carroll as.
Well, she wasn't allowed to do that. Let me, from a legal perspective, she wasn't allowed to do it. Other attorneys have suggested to me that when this comes back around and when this is all done, she's going to have a problem because she coached him in a deposition.
Interesting. By the way, she let him hang out there for a good 10 or 15 seconds after he said that. And she nudged him oh, no, that's E. Jean Carroll. It's, there's so much we can say about that E. Jean Carroll trial. I almost feel like the defense in that case before that first trial was practically non-existent. It just wasn't there. They missed deadlines. They missed deadlines by a long shot. The fact that they didn't address the dress until after the fact was shocking to me because, think about this. If you don't believe Carroll that this took place, right? You want that dress, right? You want the dress. She's got the dress. That's incredible evidence. Test it. Right. And that's something that I had heard. That conversation happened when Joe Tacopina became Trump's lawyer. There was apparently a conversation where the former president was told, listen, this is something you should do. If you really truly assert that you never met this woman in that context, what's the harm in testing the dress? There's no way she could get your DNA on the dress. Just test the dress. And so we're left with one of two possible scenarios. Again, in the vacuum that we don't know whether or not it happened. One is that Trump was scared because his DNA could very well have been on that dress. And the other is that his lawyers are just stupid.
I think that
maybe both.
Right. I think that decision went all the way back to Kasowitz because I believe that was in state court. Remember, the case was originally filed in state court, and I believe that was when Kasowitz was representing him. And the judge did, in fact, order him to do a cheek swab, and that's when Bill Barr moved the case to federal court, and then Habba took over. And my understanding is that it was going to be so much trouble to get him to give the DNA that they kind of abandoned it. And then at the end, Tacopina said, hey, if your DNA is not on the dress, this will be great. This is very funny for anybody who saw the movie Primary Colors. There is an exact thing where it's the Bill Clinton character substituting somebody else's DNA in a paternity test. And the assumption is you wouldn't substitute your DNA. You wouldn't refuse to give your actual DNA if you were 100% certain that this baby wasn't yours or that this, in this situation, the DNA on that dress is not yours. So, you could make an inference. You can't make that inference in court, but you can certainly make the inference sitting here where we are.
There is something, by the way, to learn about the handling of the early stages of the Carroll legal matter, because it actually is coming back to haunt him now. The fact that Trump, as president, utilized taxpayer funds to shield him or to attempt to shield him from his personal actions decades ago not only says a lot about his character, but it says a lot about what those around him know is coming down the pike months from now. It is very much one of the reasons why any lender, any person who would give him $500 million very well might not. Because again, he has already hidden behind the presidential seal and tried to employ the massive power of the US government to protect him and only himself. And so with all of these cases going on, whether we're talking about this massive judgment in the bank fraud trial or the potentially massive judgments that could come from these lawsuits in Washington, D.C. from the injured and killed police officers who suffered during January 6th, during that insurrection, whatever comes out of that, nobody's going to want to touch him, knowing that he will try to make himself untouchable, unreachable from the White House. He's already shown himself that he's got the capacity and that he'll employ power that way. And it goes to his character, by the way. Like he is the typical person who just seeks power at all times and then will employ it to attain even more power. And we've seen that when he was in the White House before. We saw that during the final days of his first administration, right? We're seeing it now. I mean, like, we could argue that the reason he's running for president, dating back to, almost a year ago, is that he tried to find some kind of exit door to the 4 criminal cases that he's now facing. Because the only possible way that he can get out of the classified documents case in South Florida or the January 6th election interference case in Washington, D.C. is if he is once again the head of the federal government and he's able to either kill these investigations or pardon himself, which is something he can't do with the case in Atlanta, which is state charges, and something that he can't do in New York with the Manhattan DA's case for the Stormy Daniels cover-up.
I want to get to that really in just one sec. But before, I want to ask you one question, because I've had a bunch of different answers, even on the short time that I've been doing this show. So my question is, you were in the courtroom for both trials. Do you think that Trump's presence in court the second time accounts for the $83 million verdict being so much higher than in the first trial, which was just $5 million, which is a relatively paltry sum of money compared?
So I think that, I don't know this exactly, but having been there and seen what the jurors in the courtroom had seen, the show that he put on, I think that certainly there was some harm to him caused by the fact that he was grumbling and mumbling in court and all angry. And he was just a pissed off old man.
Right. And he left during closing arguments. He stomped out during Carroll's closing arguments.
Oh yeah. No, he just acted like an angry kid. So that caused some harm. But I think I have a hard time attributing too much to that, because really, the fact is, this was a trial on damages only, and it wasn't about him putting out a statement as a private individual living at Mar-a-Lago. No,
that's interesting.
This was a case about the extremely damaging statements he made while he had the biggest microphone in the world. He was actively the president of the United States. He had a lot to do. He was handling worldwide crises 24/7, and yet he still found time to hit over and over again at this woman who had accused him of something that happened years ago.
And he did last night.
Right. But look, we could argue, in real world terms that that microphone never went away, right? But really, the U.S. president taking this much time out to attack a journalist, it had a different effect. He really had directed his followers' anger and the American public's attention to this one person. And so I think that probably hung high in the juror's conscience when they were coming up with that figure, because again, it was on damages only, right? And a huge part of that was also, aside from him being in the courtroom, it was that they were trying to punish him so that he would stop lying about it, which is something he continued to do, whether or not he was at trial. He could have not been at trial and could have stayed on Truth Social, posting from, his toilet at Mar-a-Lago surrounded by classified documents. Like, the point is, the fact that he kept shouting about it meant that the jurors did have a responsibility to put a high enough dollar figure to teach him a lesson. One that he didn't learn, by the way, because within like an hour and a half of the verdict, he did it again. He defamed her yet again. So, a part of me wonders how soon it'll be before he gets sued a third time for defamation in this case.
That would be amazing. But can we, just before we move on to it, can we talk about the difference between the federal and the state bonds? Because he's got this $83 million verdict, and we're almost to 30 days, right? She can start collecting in 30 days if he doesn't post that bond.
That's right. And he's going to have to front that money as well. But here's the thing, and this goes back to what just happened on Friday. He's not just getting hit with 83 million. He's getting hit with 83 million and then this almost $500 million number. He just, from my reporting, I do not hear that he has the cash on hand to do so. This is a 1-2 punch that is just, it's really untimely for him. But before we move on from the Carroll trial, there's something that is hard, I think, for journalists in the courtroom to capture, because our day-to-day duties are to tell the public at large what happened in the courtroom that day as it relates to the fate of the case. That's what people care about. That's why people are tuning in. But I have yet to see someone take a step back and really examine his behavior in the courtroom. And that's something that I want to address now. At the bank fraud trial and at the Carroll trial, the second one, it's worth noting what his stance is in the courtroom, how he interacts with the judges, how he responds to a judge telling him what to do and what he cannot do. I've covered lots of criminal trials. I've covered lots of civil trials. Generally speaking, the defendant exhibits some degree of respect for the court, for a particular judge, for the justice system as a whole. Yeah, occasionally you have the insane person who, jumps over the bench and lunges at the judge, right? But that's rare.
Yeah.
Trump's expressions in court, his actions in court, the things he would say, the way he smiles at times and nods at the judge and has some snarky remark, this is a man who cannot wait to get back in a position of power where he can seek vengeance on the people who are doling out these decisions. He is furious. And it's not enough to say that he's just angry in court about this particular case. No. This is a person who's presented a threat to democracy as a whole. And there are books about this at this point, about just how much of a threat he was and how seriously we should take January 6th and his plot to flip election results. Okay. But when you see him in court, he's more than just an angry billionaire. This is someone who is showing that he cannot wait until he can exact revenge. You see it when he kind of like chuckles to himself and goes, yeah, I hear you. This is someone who's preparing to fight. And so even in court, I don't think his mind is on the proceedings of that day. I think he is squarely focused on what's going to happen a year from now when he can actually employ the power he'll have with the federal government to move against these people. And that's a really dark conversation, because then we're not talking about institutions. We're not talking about judgments. No, we're talking about what this person can do when he can command law enforcement.
Look, he wasn't successful at putting Hillary Clinton in jail the first go round, but that was in some sense because he had, Bill Barr, you can say a lot of bad things about Bill Barr, but Bill Barr investigated, couldn't put anything on Hillary Clinton. And, he tried with the Durham report, and that was basically a wet fart. But I would not count on there being people like Bill Barr in the second administration.
No, he's made really clear that he has learned from what I think he'll perceive as his mistakes the first time around. He's already assembling a team of people.
Right,
who will
the Heritage
guide him
Foundation.
Through. That's right, Project 25. Yeah, we're dealing with a different candidate, a different plan ahead, which makes, by the way, the result of the 4 criminal cases against him right now so important, because some of them could very well put him behind bars before November.
Yeah, so let's do that before I know you got to go, but let's go back to state court in New York one more time, because you were in the courtroom last week when Justice Juan Merchan agreed that the criminal trial on the false business records would go forward next month. Does it strike you already, from having been there, that Trump's lawyers have managed to piss off Justice Merchan to the same extent they did with Justice Engoron and Judge Kaplan, or do you think that that's in the fullness of time?
Yes, and they didn't even need to. Look, I've been in Justice Engoron's courtroom many times. He's a really affable individual. He's really easygoing. This is the only judge I've ever seen who starts many proceedings like, hey, everybody, I'm going to crack a joke and, really like ease the tension in this courtroom. And hey, look, there are reporters in the back. Try to speak up so they can hear you. They're the eyes and ears of the public. Let's pay them some respect. Really easygoing. Trump's team still managed to piss him off, which is just incredible. He's Engoron's the kind of person that I cannot imagine what it takes to make that man angry. I really don't. He's too cool and easy. Justice Merchan, in some ways, is similar. This guy is very stoic. I mean, this is a person who had a pretty tough upbringing. His family came from Colombia. His dad worked, blue collar jobs as he, worked his way through college. As Merchan worked his way through college, he's a prosecutor in Manhattan during the 90s, which was really, really tough work. You remember the crime wave that the city was dealing with then. So he cuts his teeth doing that. And everything I hear about the people who used to work with him is he's a kind of reserved, quiet, easy. I'm not going to say easygoing, but like even tempered kind of person. And you see that on the bench. We saw that during the Trump Organization tax fraud trial in 2022. He's cool-headed.
Right.
In the current proceedings, right, the ones that deal with the Stormy Daniels cover-up case, the one that came from the Manhattan DA's office.
Right, the false business records.
Justice Merchan is at the end of his rope. He cannot with these people anymore. He cannot. But then what did it take to get there? It took a former president who is going after the judge personally.
And his kids.
And I was going to get to that. And like alleging that here's this Democrat whose kids do like political work for the Democrats. He's going after his daughter. My good. I mean, if we weren't talking about Trump, if we were talking about any other defendant, these guys would be picked up in seconds and thrown behind bars. They can't do that. Say what you about a case, have your lawyers argue before you in court and try to knock the case down on the merits. They're not even going after the merits here, right? These are ad hominem attacks against the prosecutor, against the judge, against the system. And so, no, Merchan has no tolerance for that. He's got no patience. There was this just chef's kiss, like a beautiful moment at the end of Thursday's pretrial hearing where Trump's attorney, Todd Blanche, who is a seasoned, former federal prosecutor, he's telling the judge that how could we possibly live in this system, this American justice system that's going to shove this president into court for a lengthy trial as he's trying to seek, election in the middle of the primaries. This is what a terrible system we've got. And Merchan, who at this point is just tired of hearing this crap for 2 hours, is like, again, it's hard to convey the voice he has at this point because we couldn't broadcast this. The judge is like, all right, what's your legal argument? And Todd Blanche goes, that is my legal argument. And Merchan just goes, that's not a legal argument. See you March 25th. Boom, done. And it says that's how he closes it. It was like a movie. He's done. He's absolutely done. I mean, like there was no, in my mind, a lot of people had asked me, what do you think is going to happen at this hearing? In my mind, there was no way this was going to get pushed back. I've dug into the court filings in the DA case, which interestingly are sort of hard to acquire. Not all of them are at the courthouse. I pull the file. There's a lot that's not there. I've got to rely on sources to clue me in on what exactly the back and forth is with the judge who loves to use his email instead of putting things in the court docket. There was a lot of back and forth in the past year where you could tell that Trump's lawyers were trying to employ these delay tactics by playing judges in different cases against each other. Hey, Justice Merchan, there's no way we can do this right now. We've got this case pending before this federal judge in South Florida in the documents case. And then like that very day, the same lawyers go to Judge Cannon. They're like, hey, Judge Cannon, we have this thing going on in New York. Don't know if we can make the hearing. I mean, like in my story that I wrote about this, I compared it to like a kid that like goes to both parents and it's like, hey, dad said I can go to the movies. What do you think? Hey, mom said I can go to the movies. What do you think? And so like plays them against each other. They tried this and Judge Cannon seems to play ball because she doesn't mind delaying her case for the person who appointed her to the bench. But Justice Merchan owes nothing to this guy and had no tolerance for this. And so Justice Merchan has 2 times now called up the judge in Washington, D.C., Judge Chutkan, who is handling the D.C. election interference case from Department of Justice Special Counsel Jack Smith. And Merchan, the fact that he picked up the phone and called this other judge shows that he means business. He wants to know, can we move this forward? You can. It's greenlit. And so the people who asked me earlier this week, is there any chance that, this will get delayed? I told them flatly, No, there isn't. There's no reason to. The DC case that was supposed to start at the beginning of March, on March 4th, that's not happening anymore because the Supreme Court is now considering it, right? It's on
Right.
appeal. It's going to hold that back for who knows, weeks, months.
So I'm
I don't
staying.
know.
Yep.
Right.
Right.
And so, no, the doors have opened, like the clouds have cleared. It is a bright, sunny day. The Manhattan DA can move forward. And, starting March 25th, we're looking at 6 to 8 weeks of trial, which is a lot of time. That actually puts us almost right up until the scheduled, I'm going to put that in air quotes, the scheduled start of the classified documents trial in South Florida, the federal one, which at this point I've started calling the May Be trial, because who knows if she's going to push it back even further.
I think that's functionally off the docket with the Classified Information Procedures Act stuff that she's baked into the calendar already. There's no way. I think by March 1, she'll have tapped out on that August trial date. But so I've also noticed what you've noticed about, but I think that Judge Chutkan in DC has also shown herself like more willing to play ball. Do you think that the state judges play differently from the federal judges? Like the federal judges, both Cannon and Chutkan have said like, well, they've been really solicitous about the calendar and not calling bullshit on this obvious, look, we all can see it. Judge Cannon is camping out in August to make sure that nobody else can schedule a trial then. Nobody believes that trial is going then, or in May. So do you think that the state judges have played differently from the federal judges?
I do. Having been in or watched all the hearings that involve either Justice Engoron, right, previously in the civil trial, or Justice Merchan in this upcoming criminal one, or even Judge McAfee in Atlanta, right, with the Fulton County case. These state judges aren't sort of beholden, maybe beholden is too strong a word, but you can tell that they don't operate in like the weight of the institution of federal court where, these appeals are going to take a really long time. They're going to go through the circuit. They might go their way to the Supreme Court. Like almost anything that Trump does in Florida or in DC has a potential path right to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas no, these state judges, you could tell from their demeanor in court, they just want to get this done. Let's just get this done. And it's not about political interference. It's that there's a case. You are an American citizen. You're no different than any other. You're going to be treated just like everybody else. You got something on the docket. The case is ready to go. Let's do it. We're not going to treat you differently at all.
So let me ask you a couple of final questions about Trump's behavior in court, because you reported that Trump was in court in Justice Merchan's courtroom last week and that he didn't act like a maniac, that he wasn't, snorting and making all of these loud. Do you think that he's learned his lesson? I mean, if you are correct, and I think you are, that this trial is going to go off in a month or in 5 weeks, he's going to have to be there in court. It's a criminal trial. Is he going to behave, or is he going to act like a crazy person again?
I don't think he's capable of behaving. Again, I'll go back to this idea that this is a man who doesn't just see November 5th, 2024 as light at the end of the tunnel. He almost sees it as the means by which he is going to exact retribution on these people that are coming after him. I mean, he's being really open about it against judges, against prosecutors, against journalists. He is angry because he's being hit hard right now, not just with his finances, with Friday's order, but potentially with his freedom. And keep in mind, none of these cases can truly keep him out of the White House. I mean,
right.
we're not there yet. We'll cross the Rubicon when we have to, but he could win and be sitting at Rikers Island. Good, potentially.
That would be. Crazy.
He could serve the first few days from of his presidency if he wins from inside a jail cell. He could theoretically. It's astounding to me when I talk to close friends of mine who are journalists and lawyers who cannot fathom a situation where he continues to act this way in court and then ends up behind bars because, gosh, that couldn't happen in the United States. That to me is the worst form of American exceptionalism because I wasn't even born here. I was born in the Dominican Republic. My family's Cuban and Dominican and Chilean. We're used to Latin American politics and the way that the justice system fails to work there. And yeah, these things happen. It is not outside the realm of possibility that a sizable portion of the country's population wants someone to attain the presidency who is underwater and broke and facing criminal charges or maybe even sitting in prison. These things can happen. They can happen. And we've got to deal with the reality that they can happen. And his demeanor in the courtroom will not change because it doesn't have to change, right? He still thinks he's above it all. He still thinks he's above the system. I mean, almost every day during the civil bank fraud trial, he would deliver a speech just outside the courtroom. He wasn't even allowed to do that.
That was crazy.
Like, it was a press conference every day. There was the morning one just before it started. There was the lunchtime one for our lunch break. There was the afternoon one. I mean, it was 3 mini press conferences a day going on for 11 weeks. That was nuts. Nobody could do that. But the fact that he could do that, or the fact that he thinks he can do that, means that he will do that, means that he just follows through. But again, this goes back to his sort of ideology, right? Which is that might is right and he can assert it and he'll just move forward. And there is one ideology I know of that thinks that the fist can, puncture and burst through institutions. And that's fascism. It is employing force and power to get your will. You can, if you have the will, you will get the way. You will make it happen. That's the person we're dealing with. So no, I do not think that there's any reason in the world that his behavior will change, because there's almost nothing he can do in court that will make it worse for him, that will make the case worse for him. And the worst thing that could happen is that a judge will have enough and throw him behind bars. And that is exactly what he wants, because then he can be a martyr to his MAGA cause. Nothing will generate more sympathy or movement from his people than to have the leading candidate, the man who is everything to their movement, sitting behind bars while he's being tried on criminal charges. And that's going to be a huge struggle for Justice Merchan. That's going to be a big struggle for Judge Chutkan, because the question of restraint is not one on Trump. It's one on the judges, because they have the power and authority to do so. But there are political consequences to that. And that's something that judges are really uncomfortable with. They don't want to think about that. They want to think about the law. They don't want to think about political considerations. But they'll have to. It's just something they can't escape.
Right. I've taken a lot of flack because I've said no judge is going to put him in jail without a jury say so, that he's not going to be jailed pending trial. And people say, well, why should the system not work? The same as it does for any other defendant. And the reality is it does not.
Right. No, the justice system does have huge problems. And this is a philosophical debate that we're going to be having for months. I mean, when we talk about Trump, we can talk about multiple constitutional crises at once. It's layered. But one of them, and the one that I'm most interested at the moment, is if judges don't rein him in now, when he is not president, when they have the power to throw him behind bars, when he does things in court that are unacceptable and could result in a mistrial. If they don't do that now, because they don't want to set off a firecracker, right? They don't want to blow this up further, then they've already sort of pushed off their responsibility to make the institutions work. Because, and this is the contradiction, if the institution works, then it will treat him like any other person. And to treat him differently means that we are already sort of making that future come true, where he somehow got away with it all. It's a massive contradiction. And look, you might be right that no judge will do it, but I certainly hope that if he merits it, that a judge will, because that will show that he must answer to a higher authority. He is not the highest authority now. And in court, the one thing that I wish I could relay to the people who can't be there like I am is that when he walks in the room, there is an immediate tension in the air. Mm-hmm. You can cut it with a butter knife. You feel it, because here's a man who was the commander in chief, and he's now sitting about 5 feet lower than some state judge. Wow. And he can't stand it. He's so uncomfortable. He's seething. He's angry. Yeah. I don't think he ever imagined that this would be the case, because he could have stayed in the White House in 2020 and then this would all disappear. But no.
Well, he was supposed to, right?
Right. In his mind, of course. I mean, there's no way he could have lost, right? But he couldn't imagine a world in which he has to answer to some state official. He can't imagine a world where he's going to have to pay $500 million.
And he is.
Yeah, he is. It's just, right. That's reality. There is nothing worse for Donald Trump than reality. He's managed to escape it for a long time, but it's hitting him really hard. And so I think the next 30 days are going to be pivotal when we see how he's going to react to the $83 million in the Carroll verdict, how he'll react to the $450 million plus in the bank fraud trial, and how he's going to react when he finally becomes the first American president to sit in a courtroom facing criminal charges. We're making history this year. It's a really tumultuous time, but it's exciting. And I look forward to covering it because I'm going to see this through to the end. I mean, we've got 4 trials, and those 4 very well could get going by the end of the year.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jose Pagliery, Daily Beast reporter, investigative reporter. And I hope you'll come back to talk to us again soon.
Thank you, Liz.
Wow. That was a lot. I am particularly struck by Jose saying that Trump essentially doesn't care about the outcome of these cases. He's counting on being back in the White House and not only not paying the civil and criminal penalties here, but in fact using the power of the government to exact revenge on his enemies. Also, it's an excellent point about the U.S. being unique in not prosecuting former politicians, right? We think it would be so crazy here, but look, Alberto Fujimori in Peru, Nicolas Sarkozy in France, Ehud Olmert in Israel, lots of Western democracies managed to hold politicians accountable for doing crimes without their supporters burning down the country. So that's a lot to think about. And with that, that's going to do it for us today. We will have written content up on Wednesday at the Substack and on Patreon, and I will be back Friday for a discussion with legal reporter Brandy Buckman, who covered many of the rank-and-file January 6 prosecutions in D.C. for various media outlets. On the Trump beat, we will be watching to see if the Supreme Court grants Trump a stay in the election interference case. There's also action going on behind the scenes with respect to the classified evidence in the Florida documents case, which we're going to have Cal McClanahan, a national security lawyer, on to talk about really soon as we kind of get more eyes on that. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you guys so much, and see you at the end of the week.
Law and Chaos Podcast is a production of Raise Ipsa Media, LLC, is intended solely as entertainment, does not constitute legal advice, and does not form an attorney-client relationship. This show is researched and written by Liz Dye and produced by Bryce Blankenagel. Law and Chaos Pod, copyright 2024, Raise Ipsa Media, LLC, all rights reserved.